You won't believe what went down when our power-hungry HOA president, Susan, decided to bulldoze my wheelchair ramp while I was off running the state. She thought she was dealing with some random nobody, but what this entitled neighbor didn't realize was that I'm not just any resident. I'm the governor. And this was about to blow up into the biggest mistake of her HOA career. How did it spiral into a national scandal with the whole neighborhood dragged in? Stick around. Welcome to my story. If you're into Susan and HOA drama, hit that subscribe button for more. It all started with this bright yellow piece of paper slapped on my front door. That announcement made my brother's blood boil. Fifth one this month, all about my ramp. My brother crushed it and tossed it into my growing pile of Susan Thompson's so-called official warnings. My electric wheelchair hummed up the ramp as I rolled in, and I flashed a tired smile at my brother. Another love letter from our lovely neighbor? I asked, the dark circles under my eyes giving away how wiped I was from my new gig as governor. I don't complain, though. Not about the job. Not about the car accident that landed me in this chair 6 months ago. And definitely not about Susan's nonstop harassment. You'd think being HOA president would keep her busy enough without her staking out my house. My brother smirked, peering through the kitchen window as Susan snapped pics of my ramp from her driveway. Her perfect highlights and designer workout gear couldn't hide the spike plastered across her face. I still remember the day we put that ramp in, followed every rule, hired a licensed contractor, got city permits, even painted it the exact gray to match the house trim. But Susan swooped in before the concrete dried, waving her HOA rulebook like it was the Holy Grail. Section 8, Paragraph 3 clearly states all external modifications need board approval, she'd said, her voice oozing fake concern. It's about property values, you understand. What really ticked me off was how she kept accidentally scheduling HOA meetings about my ramp when I couldn't show. Not that I could have anyway, with my days packed running the state. Yeah, that's right, I'm the governor. But we kept that under wraps around here, craving some privacy while I recovered. Last week, my brother caught her measuring the ramp with a tape measure at 6 a.m. When he called her out, she just shrugged. It's my duty as HOA president. That's when he started documenting everything, videos, notices, a full log. My gut told me we'd need it. This morning felt off, though. As my brother helped me into my car for physical therapy, I spotted Susan huddled with 2 suits by her house, pointing at my ramp and waving their arms like it was a crime scene. One scribbled in a notebook, the other snapped more pics. I don't like this, my brother muttered. Maybe it's time we let them know who they're messing with. I shook my head. No way. I'm not pulling rank for special treatment. We'll do this right, through the proper channels. But as Susan smirked, handing those guys thick manila envelopes, I wasn't so sure the rules would cut it this time. My brother whipped out his phone and started recording, catching Susan's voice floating over on the breeze. Yes, we'll need that bulldozer here first thing tomorrow. The board's already approved the removal. My heart stopped. They wouldn't really tear down my ramp, would they? As my car pulled away, my brother bolted inside to check our security cams and grab our permit folder. What he found in there? Game changer. Stuff that'd make Susan regret ever crossing us. Next morning, I was at a budget meeting when my brother texted me. He'd been eating breakfast when he heard machinery rumbling outside. Spoon hit the bowl, and he ran to the window. There was Susan in our yard, red blazer on, blonde hair perfect, pointing at my ramp while some guy in a construction hat nodded. A bright yellow bulldozer loomed in our driveway, its blade glinting like a threat. 2 workers in orange vests measured my ramp with yellow tape, while Susan hugged a stack of papers like they were gold. He grabbed his phone, hit record, and charged outside. The sun was barely up, neighbors still asleep. What do you think you're doing? He yelled, voice shakier than he'd admit. Susan turned, flashing that fake HOA meeting smile. Oh, good, you're home, she chirped, her heels sinking into our grass. I've got an emergency order from the board. This structure violates community guidelines, section 4.23. She waved a paper in his face, yanking it back before he could snatch it. And that's when it hit. This was personal, and she wasn't backing down. Susan turned on that fake smile she always plastered on at HOA meetings. Oh good, you're home, she chirped, strutting toward my brother in her designer heels, which sank a little into our fresh grass. "I have here an emergency order from the HOA board. This structure," she said, jabbing a finger at my ramp, "is in direct violation of community guidelines, section 4.23. She waved a paper in his face, but yanked it back before he could grab it. My brother took a deep breath, something I drilled into him during my campaign speeches, and said, "Susan, we submitted all the proper paperwork. We've got city approval." "The city isn't the HOA, dear." She cut him off, her smile not budging an inch. "As president of the board, it's my duty to maintain our community standards. This ramp, an eyesore. It's dragging down property values. Just look how it clashes with the neighborhood aesthetic." The bulldozer's engine revved, and I can only imagine the pit in my brother's stomach. He pulled up the property maps I'd made him save on his phone, one showing our lines and permits, and said, "This is illegal. You can't just demolish someone's property without proper notice or a court order." Susan let out this high-pitched laugh that'd make your skin crawl. "Notice was given 3 weeks ago via certified mail. We've got the receipt right here." She flashed another paper with a signature he'd never seen. He scrambled to call me, but it went straight to voicemail. Naturally, I was stuck in a closed-door budget meeting. He tried my assistant, my security team, anyone, but no dice. The workers started dropping orange cones around our driveway. One guy looked unsure, double-checking his paperwork and whispering to his buddy about something off. "If you do this," my brother warned, his voice steadying, "you'll hear from our lawyers. This violates the Americans with Disabilities Act." He started live streaming it all, catching every second. Susan's smile flickered for a split second. "The HOA is exempt," she began, but he shouted back, "No HOA is exempt from federal law," loud enough that lights flicked on in nearby houses. Our elderly neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, poked his head out, saw Susan, and ducked back inside. She didn't care. She just nodded sharply at the bulldozer operator. The machine roared to life, its treads grinding into our driveway. My brother watched, horrified, as the blade dropped toward my ramp, the one we'd spent weeks getting just right. "Last chance, Susan," he said, phone steady in his hands. "You're making a huge mistake." She spun back, eyes cold despite that smile. The only mistake was letting this monstrosity get built. Sometimes people need to learn rules exist for a reason. The blade hit the ramp with a gut-wrenching screech of metal on concrete, chunks crumbling as he kept recording. What they didn't see was Mr. Alvarez back outside with his own camera, or the neighbors starting to gather, phones up. Then my brother's phone buzzed, a text from my head of security. "Stay calm. Keep recording. Helps 3 minutes out." He grinned for the first time that morning, watching Susan orchestrate the demolition like some twisted maestro. She was so caught up in her win that she missed the black SUVs rolling onto our street, the sirens getting louder. Sometimes the biggest screw-ups come from missing the tiniest details, like not knowing your ordinary neighbor runs the damn state. I'll never forget when our quiet little street turned into a movie set. Susan was high-fiving her HOA cronies, gloating over killing the eyesore, when the first black SUV rounded the corner. Then another, and another. Red and blue lights flashed everywhere. My brother's hand shook as he kept recording. This was going to be good. Susan's smug grin melted into confusion as 3 state police cruisers pulled up, followed by 5 identical government SUVs. Neighbors who'd been peeking through curtains all morning poured onto their lawns. Everyone knew something huge was about to drop. "What is all this?" Susan snapped, her voice cracking. "This is a private neighborhood matter." That's when my security lead stepped out, scanned the scene, and opened my SUV door. The street went dead quiet as I rolled out in my wheelchair, decked in my official governor's blazer, staring her down with the look I saved for press conferences. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson," I said, loud and clear, "this became a state matter the minute you broke federal disability laws and destroyed state property without authorization." Susan was about to find out just how deep she'd dug her own grave. My lead security detail stepped out, eyes sweeping the street before opening my SUV door. The whole place went dead silent as I rolled out of my wheelchair, rocking my official governor's blazer and the no-nonsense look I save for big press conferences. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson," I said, my voice cutting through the air, "this became a state matter the second you violated federal disability protection laws." I wheeled forward, my team moving like clockwork around me, not to mention destroying state property without authorization. Susan's face cycled through 5 emotions in 3 seconds: shock, panic, you name it. "State property," she squeaked, her voice barely holding together. "Yep," I said, pulling out my phone. "Want to see the deed, or should we dive into the Americans with Disabilities Act first? I'm pretty familiar with Title II. Signed new state protections just last month." The crowd of neighbors swelled, phones popping up everywhere. Mrs. Dawson across the street was already live on Facebook. Susan stumbled back, clutching her precious violation notices like a lifeline. But the HOA bylaws clearly state. "Funny you mentioned those," I cut in, nodding to my assistant, who stepped up with a thick binder. "My legal team's been digging through your HOA bylaws all afternoon. Want to hear what they found?" I watched Susan's board buddies start edging away. Smart move. Multiple violations of state housing laws, discriminatory practices, and I paused, letting it sink in. Irregular financial records going back 3 years. The crowd gasped. My brother zoomed in on Susan's face with his phone as it went paler than those notices she loved so much. "This isn't I didn't know," she stammered, "that I'm the governor." I finished for her. Or that bulldozing a disabled person's ramp without notice or permits is a federal offense. 2 state investigators stepped up, notebooks ready. News vans were rolling in at the end of the street. "Mrs. Thompson," one said, "we'll need you to come with us to answer some questions about today and these financial discrepancies." As they led her off, still muttering about property values and bylaws, I turned to the crowd. Sitting there in my chair, surrounded by the rubble of my ramp, I felt every bit the leader I am. "My fellow neighbors," I started, "today's a chance to talk about what community really means." I gestured to the wreckage. "This isn't just about me or my access to my home. It's about everyone's right to live with dignity in their own space." The faces staring back showed shame, anger, and, most importantly, understanding. Susan got hauled off to a police car, still gripping her rulebook, and I couldn't help but wonder, what's next for our quiet little neighborhood after this blow-up? How many other HOAs are out there pulling the same stunt she did? Next morning, I woke up to my phone going nuts. Our security cam footage had blown up online overnight, and news vans were camped outside. But the real kicker? An old high school buddy, now a civil rights lawyer, called with dirt on Susan's past. I couldn't believe it when I opened his files. She'd been sued 3 times before for similar HOA power trips in other neighborhoods, always settling quietly and moving on to her next target. This time, she picked the wrong fight. I don't just get mad, I get organized. I called an emergency press conference right on our front lawn, the busted ramp pieces scattered behind me. Reporters lost it when I slapped down a stack of papers proving Susan didn't just break federal disability laws. She trashed 17 state housing regs too. Then it got wild. Our elderly neighbors started stepping up. Mrs. Nguyen from across the street told how Susan made her rip out her medical garden. Mr. Alvarez had docs showing she'd find him for a wheelchair lift for his veteran dad. Even the quiet Carter family spoke out. Susan had threatened fines over their autistic son's sensory-friendly playground gear. This neighborhood I'd known forever felt different all of a sudden. People were talking, sharing stories, standing together. Susan thought she could bulldoze her way through us, but she didn't count on me or them. We weren't just fighting for a ramp anymore. We were fighting for each other. Susan tried calling an emergency HOA meeting to spin her unfounded accusation story, but nobody showed, except her 2 loyal board cronies. Meanwhile, I'd invited disability rights advocates to our house, and half the neighborhood turned up to learn about accessible housing. Just when we thought it couldn't get crazier, someone leaked Susan's HOA financial records. Turns out she'd been pocketing fines to fund her own home renovations, passing them off as board-approved community improvements. The HOA's lawyer quit on the spot, and 3 board members bailed with furious emails that somehow hit the local news. Susan still wouldn't quit. She stormed over the next morning with a cease and desist letter, demanding we stop spreading lies. Bad move. She walked right into my meeting with the state housing commissioner, who was itching to dig through every HOA call she'd made in the last 5 years. The look on her face when she realized her little reign of terror was toast? Almost worth all the chaos. Almost. The real payoff was watching neighbors stick support accessible housing signs in their yards, one by one, until Susan's place stood out like a sore thumb. No sign in sight. News choppers buzzed overhead, catching it all, and by sunset, our story was national news. That evening, I watched folks gather on our lawn, swapping stories and sketching out a new, inclusive HOA. How'd one wheelchair ramp spark this kind of upheaval? The night wasn't done, though. I'd just gotten docs tying the bulldozing company to Susan's private contracting gig. Next morning, my phone was blowing up with messages, neighbors spilling their own HOA nightmares, reporters begging for interviews. But what grabbed me was an email from Mrs. Alvarez, our elderly neighbor Susan fined for her garden gnome. She had proof of more laws Susan broke. I printed every HOA rule and spent the day highlighting all the stuff Susan ignored. My legal team uncovered she never even filed the right papers to become HOA president, just swooped in when the old one left, and no one dared call her out. The deeper we dug, the dirtier it got. Then something wild happened. Our story hit Ethan Park, that YouTube lawyer who tears apart shady housing rules. He flew in, met with me, and offered to sue Susan and the HOA pro bono. His video on our case racked up millions of views in a day. Susan tried another emergency meeting to save face, but this time, it wasn't her usual snooze fest with 2 half-asleep neighbors. The community center was packed. People who'd never spoken up were spilling tea on her bullying. Mr. Dawson showed pics of his daughter's treehouse. Susan forced him to axe. The Fosters vented about their Christmas lights she deemed too bright. I rolled up to the mic and didn't just talk ramp. I unveiled my big plan. A new law to shield homeowners from HOA abuse, the Right to Home Happiness Act. The room exploded in cheers. Our security footage sealed it. Susan lied on official docs about getting ramp approval. Her own lawyer dropped her case 2 days later. Then we watched her pack up those prized rose bushes she'd forced everyone to mimic and hightail it out of town. The new HOA board's a game changer. They turned the old violations office into a community help center. Now they send welcome baskets instead of fines and kicked off a program for elderly folks' home repairs. My ramp? Rebuilt, but better. Local artists painted it with flowers, added soft glow lights. Neighborhood kids call it the prettiest thing on the street. Last week, I threw a barbecue in our backyard for everyone. Seeing folks laugh and eat where Susan used to bark about grass height rules hit me hard. Sometimes the worst crap leads to the best change. The bulldozing company CEO even reached out, apologized personally, and started offering free ramp installs statewide. Watching our neighborhood turn into something real, something good, I knew we'd done more than just survive Susan. We'd flipped the script. Remember that bulldozing company? They've flipped the script, now offering free ramp installations to disabled folks across the state. Their CEO called me up personally to apologize, and they even launched a scholarship fund for students studying disability rights law. Talk about a turnaround. But the real shocker hit yesterday. I got tapped to run the state's new homeowner protection office. My first gig? Teaching other neighborhoods how to turn their bully HOAs into something that actually helps. My brother says we're just getting started, and looking at how much has changed in a year, I believe him. Our stories even popped up as school textbooks. Case study on standing up to unfair rules. But the real win isn't the headlines or the laws we're pushing through. It's the small stuff. Mrs. Alvarez's garden gnome army growing bigger every week. Kids playing on their front lawns without sweating violation notices. Susan's old house sold last week. New family moved in, 3 kids, 2 dogs, and guess what's out front? A wheelchair ramp for their grandma. No one griped. Instead, 5 neighbors showed up to help them unpack. That's when it hit me. We didn't just fix an HOA, we changed minds. This wasn't about one ramp or one power-tripping neighbor anymore. It was about showing what a community can be when it stops nitpicking and starts lifting each other up. We're not done yet, either. There's a whole state out there waiting for a shakeup, and I've got the chair, the blazer, and the team to make it happen. And you, where are you hearing this story? And have you ever gone against HOA? Would you like more stories about someone going against HOA? If your answer is yes, please like and subscribe to the channel so that YouTube can notify you every time we post another story on the channel.